All this week, we're taking a different look at aspects of the Bush presidency. As we look forward, we also look backward. Today, we're looking at the issue of keeping America safe. As President Bush makes his round of final speeches, his long goodbye with interviews, etc., he's taking credit a lot of times, fairly or not, that the United States was not attacked after 9/11. In other words, ever since September 11, 2001, after that horrendous attack in New York and here in Washington on the Pentagon, we have not been hit at home. Is he due credit for this? This is a big question for the historians. And what's been the cost, if there has been one, in terms of America's record morally in the world, militarily in the world, the loss of life, in keeping that record? Joining me is Joe Conason of the New York Observer and Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. The White House has released a list, a fact sheet, if you will, of areas in which where the United States was threatened. In fact, there was an attempt to hurt us since 9/11, an attempt to bomb fuel tanks at the JFK airport, a plot to blow up airliners bound for the East Coast, a plan to destroy a Los Angeles skyscraper, a plot by 6 al-Qaeda-inspired individuals to kill soldiers at Fort Dix in New Jersey, a plan to attack a Chicago area shopping mall, a plot to attack the Sears Tower in Chicago. Joe Conason, does this administration deserve the credit it has given itself?
Well, you know, Chris, they're going to get some credit because it was President Bush's watch. But as you suggested at the top of the show, you can't start the clock when you choose if you're president. The clock starts the day that you're inaugurated. That was January 20th, 2001. 9 months later, almost, the country suffered the worst terrorist attack in post-World War II history, and they have to take a share of responsibility for that as well. All of the attacks that you just mentioned, I think there were 6, are actually pared down from a list they used to use of 10 supposed attacks that they thwarted. None of these attacks, except for, I guess, one, were even alleged to have come from al-Qaeda. Very few of them, if any, were actually serious conspiracies that had reached an operational stage. So it's a pretty thin list. I think al-Qaeda's ability to mount a serious attack against us was gravely diminished after we went after them in Afghanistan, which the president does deserve praise for.
Well, Frank Gaffney, do you defend this administration's record in terms of protecting the United States from day one, or just since after 9/11?
Look, I would say, Chris, that the president deserves criticism for having continued the Clinton administration's policies in so many areas: intelligence, counterterrorism, homeland security, the wall, as they call it, between intelligence and law enforcement, that contributed, I think, to the fiasco, the disaster, the catastrophe, if you will, of 9/11. So I would cite that as a legitimate grounds for criticism. I do think the president and his team. No, but hear me out, Chris. The president deserves credit. Give him credit for what he is entitled to, Chris. After 9/11, he learned from the mistakes that he made
Clinton
before.
For 9/11? You're blaming Clinton for 9/11?
I'm blaming
They've
the
been doing this for years, Chris. This is nonsense.
It's an objective reality.
It is not an objective reality.
That were
President Clinton
by the
tried
Clinton
to warn
administration.
President Bush about this.
May I have the floor? Just to respond to your question.
You're blaming Clinton for 9/11. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying that the policies that were in place when this president took office, that he did not change for 9 months, I think he deserves criticism for doing that. I think the Clinton administration's policies for the previous period contributed to a whole series of attacks that we had, and I would argue contributed to the belief that al-Qaeda had that they could conduct the attacks of 9/11 with impunity. But give him his due after 9/11 for having learned from some of those mistakes, and I think having made significant changes that have kept us safer.
Okay, let's take a look at what happened back in 9/11 since we're back there. The President's daily briefing on August 6, 2001 said bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S. Let's take a look at Richard Ben-Veniste questioning Connie Rice in the Iraq study group, questioning what she thought and how she reacted to that memo.
I remember very well that the president was aware that there were issues inside the United States. He talked to people about this, but I don't remember the al-Qaeda cells as being something that we were told we needed to do something about.
Isn't it a fact, Dr. Rice, that the August 6 PDB warned against possible attacks in this country. And I ask you whether you recall the title of that PDB.
I believe the title was Bin Laden Determined to Attack Inside the United States. Now, the PDB... No, Mr. Benveniste...
Frank Gaffney, your thoughts?
No, that makes the point that I'm trying to make. I think the Bush administration was, I believe, inadequately steeled to the reality that those, in this particular case, al-Qaeda, but more generally, who adhere to what the Islamists call Sharia, were in fact intent on bringing their terrorist attacks to us in a highly lethal way. And I think the administration does deserve to be criticized for, as I say, having not changed course from the kinds of policies in this area that they inherited. But they did after 9/11, and I think you just have to give them credit for that too, Chris.
Chris,
yes, the response from Joe Conason.
Well, look, President Clinton and Richard Clark and other officials of the Clinton administration tried from before January 20th, 2001, as the transition was occurring to the new Bush administration, to warn President-elect at that time Bush, Vice President-to-be Cheney, and other incoming officials of the grave danger from al-Qaeda. Why? Because they had stopped several attacks on American soil that al-Qaeda had planned, because they had a very robust anti-terrorist operation before the Bush administration began. And, you know, the history on this is extremely clear. Frank's completely wrong about this. The Bush administration ignored those warnings, not from August 6, 2001, but from January 20th, 2001. And the record is completely clear. Paul O'Neill made this point in his memoirs very clearly. Richard Clark has made this point. This is the history that's going to be examined as this administration passes.
Well,
and the attempts to try to blame this on President Clinton are absurd.
Look, I hope
Frank, who's going to win this battle? Do you think the president who's leaving office will be blamed for 9/11, not preparing for it? Do you think he will be blamed?
I think, as I've just suggested, he's entitled to be blamed for some of this, but he shouldn't be blamed for what the Clinton administration didn't do before its watch, which led, among other things, to the coal disaster and the embassy bombings in Africa. You can't honestly say, Joe, that this was just a completely sealed trap when there were serious threats, there were serious terrorist attacks, there was a serious failure to go after bin Laden on the Clinton administration's watch. But look, the main point is, Chris, I think the reality is we are grateful. We should be grateful, whether you're Democrats who hate George Bush or whether you're Republicans who love him or whether you're like a lot of other people who just are grateful to still be alive in this country at 7 years after 9/11 without another serious attack. And I think we ought to give the president his due. And the fault, if you wish, but not with blinders on about what preceded it.
Speaking of responsibility, in today's Washington Post, Bob Woodward reports that the alleged 20th hijacker from 9/11 cannot be prosecuted. He quotes Susan Crawford, the convening authority of military commissions, saying, quote, "We tortured Qahtani. His treatment met the legal definition of torture, and that's why I did not refer the case for prosecution." Frank, if we torture, I guess we get evidence. That may be ends justifying the means. But in that case, we've admitted that the means were torture. Do you think that is justified in the protection of this country?
I think there are circumstances in which it is justified. Chris, I don't know if this was one of them.
Joe?
Well, that at least was an honest answer. We don't know whether the torture that has gradually been revealed ever brought forth any useful information. And a lot of our experienced military leaders believe that torture is actually very much against the interests of the United States, almost never results in usable information, and should not be our policy. And that we lose moral authority every time we do it.
I think that's generally right, and I think there are exceptions, and I think most people on both sides of the aisle would agree that there are circumstances, ticking time bombs and the like, where you're going to use extreme measures. And I just hope we don't have to run that gauntlet again.
Unfortunately, we went much further than that.
Not in this case, I don't think.